The early morning sun broke through the scattered clouds over Madison, casting long shadows along the streets as Officer James Jim Hayes and his German shepherd Sam moved through the quiet neighborhood. It was a peaceful day so far, their usual patrol through the bustling city, where Jim had walked these streets countless times over the years. His hand rested on the sturdy leash that linked him to Sam, though in truth, Sam hardly needed the guidance. They moved in sync, as if the leash were just a formality. "Another day, huh, Sam?" Jim said, his voice casual, but his eyes alert as he scanned the sidewalks. "I wonder what kind of mess we'll walk into today." Sam flicked his ears, glancing up at Jim with those sharp, intelligent eyes. He understood the rhythm of their work as well as any human partner could. His steps matched Jim's, his head held high, nose occasionally twitching at unfamiliar scents carried on the wind. This was their routine, patrolling the streets, the calm before any potential storm, always keeping one ear open for the call that could change everything. Jim smiled softly, feeling the weight of the years they had spent together. He remembered the first time he met Sam, just a pup, fresh from training, with boundless energy and curiosity. Now, Sam had grown into a seasoned partner, reliable in every situation. They had been through thick and thin together. "Remember that chase back in 5 years ago?" Jim murmured, mostly to himself, though he knew Sam was listening. "Thought for sure we'd lost that guy, but you weren't having any of it." Sam let out a low rumble, almost like he understood the memory and shared in the satisfaction of a job well done. Jim chuckled, giving the leash a light tug as they turned the corner, heading toward Lincoln District. It was a rougher part of town, notorious for petty crime and the occasional brawl that flared up between local gangs. Jim had come to expect trouble there, though he hadn't anticipated anything serious today. Just as they passed a graffiti-stained building, the radio on Jim's shoulder crackled to life. "Unit 27. We have reports of a disturbance at Lincoln Square. Several individuals involved in a brawl. Possible escalation. Proceed with caution." Jim sighed, reaching for the radio. "Copy that. We're close. On our way." He clicked it off, glancing down at Sam. "Looks like we've got some action after all. Ready?" Sam's posture stiffened in response, ears perked up. He was always ready. They picked up the pace, moving with purpose toward Lincoln Square. As they approached, Jim could hear the telltale sounds of raised voices and the dull thud of bodies colliding. The brawl was still going strong, and from the sound of it, things were getting out of hand. Jim's grip on the leash tightened, but he kept his pace measured. No need to rush in blind. The streets of Lincoln Square were alive with noise. Voices clashed in the air, some raised in anger, others in excitement. The familiar hum of the city had given way to chaos, though from a distance it could almost pass for the usual din of urban life. But as Officer Jim approached the square, he could feel it, a tension simmering just beneath the surface. His partner, Sam, sensed it too. The dog's ears perked up, his posture tightening as they closed in. "Easy, boy," Jim muttered, gripping the leash just a little tighter. "Let's see what we're dealing with." From their position on the edge of the square, Jim could already make out a group of young men shoving and cursing at each other, the center of a growing crowd. He scanned the scene quickly, assessing the situation as he always did. Years of experience had taught him to look for signs, small cues that things were about to escalate. It wasn't deadly yet, but fights like these had a way of turning ugly fast. Sam's eyes were locked on the commotion, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, waiting for the signal. Jim could feel the dog's readiness through the taut line of the leash. "Hold on, Sam," he said under his breath. "Not yet." Taking a deep breath, Jim stepped forward, easing through the crowd. His uniform and calm presence alone were enough to draw attention, though it didn't stop the fight. Not yet. The young men continued to shove and shout, caught in the heat of whatever had set them off. Jim could see it in their eyes, the wild, untamed anger that often flared in moments like this, sometimes over nothing, sometimes over everything. "All right, that's enough," Jim called out, his voice steady but loud enough to cut through the noise. "Let's break it up." For a second, no one moved. The fighters were too deep into their own fury to hear reason, and the crowd was feeding off the spectacle, making it harder for any one voice to stand out. Jim moved closer, stepping into the circle of chaos. Sam stayed by his side, low growls rumbling in his chest. The dog's presence alone gave Jim an edge. People tended to take one look at Sam and think twice before doing anything stupid. But that didn't mean the danger was over. Jim's gaze locked onto one of the bigger men, his face twisted with anger, fists clenched tight. "I said enough," Jim repeated, this time directing his words toward the guy. "Take a breath and walk away before this gets worse." For a moment, it looked like the man might listen. His eyes flickered, uncertainty passing through them. But then, from behind, someone shoved him again, reigniting the rage. The big man turned, his fist flying blindly. Jim barely had time to react before the crowd surged, bodies pressing in as the brawl escalated. A sharp shove hit Jim square in the chest, knocking him off balance. He stumbled back, catching himself before he fell, but not before the sting of a scrape burned across his forearm. "Damn it," Jim muttered, gritting his teeth. Before he could even regain his footing, Sam was there, his growl deepening, the fur along his back bristling as he stepped in front of Jim. "Easy, Sam," Jim murmured, though he appreciated the dog's protective instincts. The tension in the air was thick now, and Jim knew this was the tipping point. He could feel it in the way the crowd shifted, the way the brawlers' movements became more frantic, less controlled. If something didn't change soon, it would spiral out of control. Jim's focus sharpened. In the middle of the melee, two figures were slipping away, unnoticed by most, but not by him. His eyes narrowed as he tracked their movements. These two weren't just random fighters caught up in the chaos. There was something deliberate about the way they moved, how they stayed just on the edge of the violence, never fully committing to the fight. Jim's instinct screamed that these two were trouble. Sam, sensing Jim's shift in attention, followed his gaze, his body still tense, but his growling quieting. Jim took a step forward, pushing through the crowd, keeping the two men in his sights. They were moving quickly now, edging toward the exit of the square, away from the chaos they'd helped create. "Stay close," Jim muttered to Sam as they made their way after them. His arm still stung from the earlier scrape, but that was the least of his worries. He had to get a handle on this before the situation got out of control. As Jim and Sam closed in on the edge of the crowd, the two men finally broke into a run. "Of course," Jim sighed, tightening his grip on Sam's leash. The dog tensed, ready for the chase. The sound of fleeing footsteps was unmistakable, a sharp contrast to the fading noise of the brawl behind him. Jim's eyes narrowed as he caught sight of the two men slipping through the crowd at the edge of Lincoln Square. They hadn't been part of the main fight, too quick, too deliberate in their movements. These weren't just brawlers, they were running. "Sam, we've got company," Jim muttered under his breath. Sam responded immediately, his body shifting beside Jim, muscles taut, waiting for the signal. The dog's focus was sharp, eyes trained on the two men weaving their way through the busy streets of Riverside, a commercial area where shoppers and pedestrians moved in clusters. For a moment, Jim took in the scene. Cars honking in the distance, street vendors shouting their sales, and the swell of voices blending together. But his attention remained fixed on the suspects, their figures moving like shadows through the crowd. Without a word, Jim quickened his pace, and Sam stayed right by his side. The chase had begun. The first few strides were tense but controlled. Jim's boots hit the pavement with purpose, the familiar weight of his utility belt bouncing with each step. Sam's paws padded silently beside him, keeping rhythm, his ears pinned forward as they gained ground. Jim could hear the ragged breaths of the men up ahead, their movements growing more erratic as they realized they were being pursued. The streets of Riverside weren't designed for a quick escape. Narrow alleys, sharp corners, and throngs of people turned every sprint into a gamble. The men ducked into an alley, and Jim followed without hesitation. The alley walls seemed to close in as they ran, the noise of the city muffled by the tight space. Jim's breathing was steady, but he could feel his pulse quickening. Sam's pace never faltered, his instincts kicking in. "Stay with me, boy," Jim murmured, though he knew Sam didn't need the reassurance. The alley twisted sharply to the left, and Jim barely managed to avoid colliding with the wall. The men were moving faster now, their footsteps slapping against the wet pavement, echoing off the brick walls. One of them glanced back, panic flashing in his eyes as he saw Jim and Sam gaining on them. Jim didn't need to see their faces to know what they were thinking. This was no longer just about escaping a brawl. They were running from something bigger. They emerged from the alley onto a crowded street, nearly colliding with a group of tourists. The two men barreled through the crowd, scattering pedestrians in their wake. Jim slowed slightly, weaving through the people with practiced ease. Sam stayed close, his body low, eyes fixed on the fleeing figures. Every second that passed, the tension grew thicker. Jim's mind raced as they continued the chase. These men had a plan. They weren't just random punks. But why were they running? What had they been hiding in that fight? The questions gnawed at him, but there was no time to dwell on them now. He had to focus on the chase. The men took another sharp turn, ducking down a set of stairs that led to the back of a row of shops. Jim and Sam followed, the narrow passageway forcing them to slow for just a moment. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Closer now. Jim could sense their desperation. Sam, too, had picked up on the shift. His pace quickened, pulling slightly at the leash, ready to close the gap. The narrow alley behind Lakeside Mall was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of Jim's neck stand up. His breath slowed as he followed the two suspects into the shadowed corridor, Sam glued to his side, alert and ready. The air felt different here, thicker, heavier, like it was holding its breath. "Something's off," Jim muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the walls ahead. The suspects had disappeared around the corner, leaving only the faint echo of their footsteps in the damp alley. He edged forward, every nerve in his body on high alert. Sam's ears were pinned back, his stance rigid, muscles coiled tight, as if waiting for the inevitable. They both knew this wasn't just a chase anymore. It was about to get ugly. Then, out of nowhere, the sound of gunfire ripped through the stillness. "Shit!" Jim barely had time to react as the first shot rang out, ricocheting off the brick wall behind him. He ducked instinctively, but the second shot came fast. A searing pain tore through his shoulder, followed by a brutal impact in his side. He staggered backward, the force of the bullets sending him crashing to the ground. Sam barked sharply, the sound cutting through the alley, but it felt distant to Jim. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, spreading like fire through his body. He pressed a hand to his side, feeling the warmth of his own blood seeping through his uniform. His head swam, vision blurring as the world tilted on its axis. His fingers fumbled for the radio clipped to his vest. "Officer! Down!" He managed to gasp, voice weak, before his strength gave way. His body collapsed fully onto the cold ground, the weight of consciousness slipping from him. Sam was there in an instant, nudging Jim with his nose, whining low in his throat. The dog's normally sharp, confident demeanor cracked, a quiet panic settling in as he circled his fallen partner. His paws scraped the pavement, trying to get Jim to move, to respond. But Jim didn't stir. The alley seemed to close in on them, the silence broken only by the shallow breaths escaping Jim's lips and Sam's distressed whimpers. Sam's protective instincts kicked in, but beneath them was a desperation he couldn't control. He crouched low, positioning himself over Jim, his body tense, head swiveling between the alley's entrance and Jim's lifeless form. Every sense was on high alert, waiting for the next threat to emerge, but his focus remained on Jim. Sam nudged Jim again, more insistently this time, a deep growl rising from his throat, but it wasn't out of aggression. It was fear. The minutes felt like hours. Sam barked, sharp and quick, trying to rouse Jim, trying to signal for help, but no one came. His tail lowered, his ears flicked back, and his eyes darted from side to side, trying to assess the danger that still lingered in the shadows. Yet, despite his instinct to protect and defend, he couldn't leave Jim's side. He wouldn't. The cold of the alley crept in as Jim lay motionless beneath Sam's vigilant guard, his breath shallow and strained. Sam's whining grew softer, more desperate, as if he knew time was running out. His eyes, always so sharp and alert, were filled with a mixture of loyalty and helplessness. He leaned down, resting his head gently on Jim's chest, listening for the faint heartbeat beneath. Seconds passed, maybe minutes. Sam stayed close, his body pressing against Jim's, as if his warmth alone could pull his partner back from the brink, but Jim didn't move. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens began to cut through the city noise, growing louder with every passing second. Help was on the way, but the alley felt like its own world, detached from the bustling streets beyond. For now it was just Sam and Jim, caught in the quiet, agonizing stillness between life and death. Sam lifted his head, ears twitching at the approaching sound of rescue, but his eyes never left Jim's face. His partner was down. The emergency lights flashed as the ambulance screeched to a halt at Riverside Memorial Hospital. The paramedics were swift, moving Jim's unconscious body onto a gurney, his wounds wrapped in hastily applied bandages. Blood soaked through the gauze, a stark reminder of how close the line was between life and death. Sam could only watch from the edge of the parking lot, his leash loosely held by one of Jim's fellow officers. His usual confident, controlled presence had vanished. The German shepherd's eyes never left the gurney, his ears pricked at every sound of hurried footsteps, every sharp command from the medical staff. He pulled at the leash, trying to follow, but the officer held firm. "You can't go in, Sam," the officer murmured, his voice low. But Sam didn't understand rules or restrictions. He understood Jim, his partner, his lifeline, the one person he had followed into countless dangers. Now Jim was being wheeled into a place Sam couldn't go. As the hospital doors swung shut, Sam's tail drooped. His eyes darted to the windows of the emergency room, catching glimpses of nurses and doctors rushing past. But Jim was out of sight now. The sterile walls of the hospital felt like a barrier too high to cross. And yet Sam stayed rooted to his spot, his paws firmly planted on the cold concrete outside. The minutes stretched into hours. The light outside dimmed as the evening crept in, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Sam paced anxiously, moving in small circles near the entrance, his ears flicking back and forth, catching snippets of conversation, footsteps, and distant sirens. He was attuned to every shift in the atmosphere, his senses heightened, his instincts driving him to stay close. Occasionally, a nurse or a doctor would glance through the glass doors at Sam, their faces softening with sympathy. They had seen their share of concerned family members pacing outside these same doors. But There was something about the way Sam watched, unwavering, that tugged at them differently. His quiet vigilance was hard to ignore. Jim's fellow officers had gathered outside the hospital too, leaning against their squad cars, speaking in low tones. One of them, Officer Taylor, approached Sam, kneeling beside him. "He'll be okay, Sam," Taylor said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. Sam only glanced at him briefly, before turning his gaze back to the entrance, waiting, always waiting. The hospital lights flickered on as the sky darkened further. The cold, sterile atmosphere of the hospital stood in stark contrast to the raw, unspoken tension outside. Sam's pacing had slowed, but he remained alert. He settled by the entrance, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the doors that had swallowed Jim hours ago. Inside, the battle for Jim's life continued. The doctors worked quickly, methodically, but the wounds were serious. Every second felt weighted, dragging on with the slow, steady march of time. Outside, Sam felt each moment pass like a heavy stone pressing down on him, though he had no way of knowing exactly what was happening beyond the walls. He simply knew Jim wasn't with him, and that was enough to keep his worry alive, gnawing at his instincts. As the hours stretched into the night, the hospital doors finally swung open. A doctor stepped out, his face weary but composed. The officers straightened, and Sam's ears shot up, his attention fully locked on the man in the white coat. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was enough. The doctor spoke softly to Jim's colleagues, explaining that Jim had made it through surgery, though it would be touch and go for the next few days. "He's stable," the doctor said finally, offering a glimmer of hope. The officers exchanged relieved glances, but Sam stayed where he was, his eyes still searching the faces coming and going through the doors. One of the officers bent down to pat Sam's head. "He'll pull through, boy," he said, trying to sound confident. The minutes crawled by, and the world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the hospital's bright lights and the cold air. Sam didn't budge. His worry hadn't lessened, it had only deepened with each passing hour. His loyalty to Jim was unspoken but unwavering, stronger than any leash or command. As long as Jim was inside, Sam would wait. Jim woke slowly, the world around him blurry and muted. His eyelids felt heavy, as though they were made of lead, and the sterile smell of the hospital was the first thing that truly anchored him to reality. A dull, relentless ache pulsed through his shoulder, radiating down his arm with every shallow breath he managed. He blinked, taking in the white ceiling and the low hum of machinery. Riverside Memorial, the surgery, the alley, the pain. It all came back in flashes, each memory sharper than the last. He tried to move, but the effort sent a bolt of pain searing through his body, and he groaned, sinking back into the stiff hospital bed. His shoulder throbbed, wrapped tightly in bandages, and every inch of him felt like it had been weighed down by exhaustion. "Great," he muttered to himself, voice raspy. "This is going to take a while." The thought of recovery felt insurmountable. Jim had been through injuries before, bruises, sprains, even a broken rib once. But this was different. This time the pain was deeper, more personal. He had been on the edge, closer to not making it than he ever wanted to admit. And the road back, it stretched out in front of him, longer and harder than anything he'd faced. A soft knock at the door broke through his thoughts. It creaked open, and Sam padded in, led by one of the nurses. The moment Jim's eyes locked onto his partner, the tension in his chest eased, just a little. Sam, for his part, wasted no time. He was at Jim's side in seconds, his large brown eyes filled with concern as he sniffed the air around Jim, then nudged his muzzle gently against Jim's good hand. "Hey, buddy," Jim murmured. his voice quieter now, the pain momentarily forgotten. He lifted his hand, an action that sent a fresh wave of soreness through him, and let it rest on Sam's head, fingers threading through the thick fur. The connection was immediate, grounding him in a way that nothing else could. Sam stayed close, leaning into Jim, his presence a steady, calming force. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, but no words were needed. In Sam's quiet loyalty, Jim found comfort. They had been through so much together, and somehow, through all the pain and fear, this moment made him feel a little less alone. Jim's mind wandered as he stroked Sam's fur. He thought back to the years they'd spent together, late-night shifts, tense chases, the silent understanding that had developed between them over time. Sam had always been there, every single time. When things got dangerous, when the stakes were high, Sam was the one constant Jim could count on. The alley flashed in Jim's mind again, those moments after the shots were fired, the pain hitting him like a truck. He remembered collapsing, and then Sam's frantic presence beside him, nudging him, refusing to leave his side. That had been Sam's way of saying, "I'm still here. You're not alone." "Should have known you'd pull through," Jim said softly, his throat tight. "You always do." Sam looked up at him, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of Jim's voice. The dog's tail gave a small, hesitant wag, as if he understood, and maybe he did. Sam had always been good at that, picking up on what Jim needed without words. The thought of recovery didn't seem so overwhelming with Sam here. The road ahead was still long, and Jim knew it wasn't going to be easy. He would have to push through the physical therapy, deal with the frustration of a body that wasn't cooperating, but knowing that Sam would be there every step of the way made it more bearable. The fluorescent lights in the hospital room flickered as Jim lay still, his body aching in ways he hadn't imagined possible. The first few days had passed in a fog of medication and nurses bustling in and out, their clipped voices murmuring updates. But today, the fog had cleared, and the reality of his situation hit like a freight train. The doctor stood at the foot of his bed, flipping through Jim's chart. His face was solemn, the kind of expression that spoke volumes without saying much. "You've got a long road ahead, Jim," he said. "The bullet damaged your spine. We're not sure yet if you'll regain full mobility." Jim stared at the ceiling, the words sinking in like a slow, icy drip. "You're saying I might not walk again?" The doctor didn't flinch. "It's a possibility, yes. But with aggressive physical therapy, there's a chance. It's going to be tough, though." "Tough," Jim echoed, his voice flat. It felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. Sam, curled up by the bed, lifted his head, ears perked as if sensing the shift in the room. Jim didn't need to look at his partner to feel the weight of his gaze. Sam was always watching, always waiting. The next morning, Madison Rehab Center felt like a world away from the chaos of the city streets. Jim sat in a wheelchair, staring blankly at the equipment lined up against the walls, the treadmills, the handrails, the weights. His body felt heavy, foreign. He used to be strong, used to rely on his body to get him through anything. Now every movement was a battle. The physical therapist, Ellen G., was patient but firm. She guided him through the first exercises, small, deliberate movements meant to get his muscles firing again. It was torture. His legs felt like lead, barely responding to his brain's commands. Every stretch, every attempt to stand sent jolts of pain up his spine. Jim gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. He muttered under his breath. Sam sat at his feet, eyes fixed on him, unwavering. The dog's presence was a silent anchor, and somehow that steady gaze kept Jim going. When he faltered, Sam was there, his head nudging Jim's hand or his warm body pressing close as if to say, "I'm here. Don't stop." The sessions dragged on for what felt like hours, though the clock on the wall told a different story. Ellen's voice was calm but insistent, pushing him to keep trying, keep moving. Jim hated it. Hated the way his body betrayed him, hated how weak he felt. And yet, every time he was ready to give up, Sam would nudge him again, his eyes holding a kind of quiet determination. Days turned into weeks. Jim's progress was painfully slow, every inch gained feeling like a mile. There were moments when he could lift himself a little higher, take a few shaky steps with the parallel bars, but the setbacks came just as often. Some days his legs wouldn't move at all, and the frustration bubbled over. "I don't know if I can do this, Sam," Jim muttered one afternoon, his arms shaking as he tried and failed to stand. His hands gripped the bars tightly, knuckles white with effort. Sam was there, sitting at his feet, watching with those same focused eyes. He didn't move, didn't whine. He just was. A constant, unwavering presence. And that, somehow, was enough. "You're doing better," Ellen said, her voice steady as she adjusted his posture. "It's going to take time, Jim, but you're getting there." Jim didn't feel like he was getting anywhere, but every time he wanted to quit, he'd glance down at Sam, sitting patiently, tail thumping quietly on the floor, and something inside him shifted. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him to try again. Weeks passed, and the small victories became more frequent. Jim could stand for longer now, even take a few tentative steps without collapsing. But the road was still long, and the weight of his injury hung over him like a shadow. The setbacks came too, each one a harsh reminder that recovery wasn't a straight line. There were days when his legs felt dead again, unmoving despite his best efforts. Days when the frustration and the pain almost broke him. But Sam was always there. Even when Jim cursed at the pain, even when he lashed out in anger, Sam never left his side. The dog's quiet loyalty was like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge every time. Through it all, Jim learned to lean on Sam in ways he hadn't before. It wasn't just about the physical anymore. It was about having something to hold on to when the world felt too heavy. The rehabilitation had been slow, agonizing, but not without small victories. Jim had begun to stand longer, take a few more steps each day. His body, once a stranger to him, was starting to feel familiar again, though the pain was ever present, lurking beneath every movement. There were moments of progress, brief flickers of hope that maybe, just maybe, things were getting better. Sam had been by his side through it all. Every day the German shepherd waited quietly during the therapy sessions, his eyes trained on Jim as if willing him to keep going. Sam's presence was a steady comfort, a reminder that Jim wasn't in this fight alone. But that night as Jim lay in bed, staring at the dimly lit ceiling of his hospital room, something felt wrong. He shifted uncomfortably, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His legs, which had finally started to regain some strength, felt strange, numb and disconnected. Ignoring the warning signs, Jim decided to push through it. "I can do this," he whispered to himself, teeth clenched as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The room seemed to spin for a moment, but he steadied himself, gripping the bed rail tightly. Sam lifted his head from his spot by the bed, ears twitching, watching Jim's every movement. The dog stood, his body tense, sensing something off. Jim didn't notice. He was too focused on the task at hand, making it to the bathroom on his own. With a slow, deliberate effort, Jim pushed himself to his feet. His legs wobbled under his weight, but he took a step, and then another. He could feel his muscles straining, but he was determined. Just a few more steps. That's when the world suddenly went black. Jim's vision blurred, and a sharp, searing pain shot through his head, so intense it brought him to his knees. His body crumpled, hitting the cold tile floor with a sickening thud. He tried to move, to call out, but his body refused to obey. It was as though every connection had been severed, leaving him trapped inside his own skin. Sam sprang into action immediately. The German shepherd barked loudly, his voice echoing through the sterile hospital corridors. The sound was frantic, desperate. He knew something was horribly wrong. Sam nosed at Jim's face, his eyes wide with fear, but Jim didn't respond. The barking grew louder, more insistent, as Sam rushed to the door. His paws scraped against it, his powerful barks filling the otherwise quiet hospital with urgency. It didn't take long for the staff to respond. 2 nurses and a doctor ran down the hall toward Jim's room, the sound of Sam's barking guiding them. When they burst through the door, they found Jim sprawled on the floor, motionless. Sam was still at his side, whimpering softly, nudging Jim's hand as if trying to wake him. The doctor knelt by Jim's body, checking for a pulse. His face was grim as he looked up at the nurses. "We need a crash cart. Now." But even as the nurses scrambled to get the equipment, the doctor's expression didn't change. His hands moved methodically, performing chest compressions, but there was something final in the way he worked. He didn't speak, but the slow shake of his head told the nurses all they needed to know. Outside the room, the hallway grew eerily quiet. The other officers who had been visiting Jim earlier gathered, their faces tight with fear and concern. The faint sounds of medical equipment and the doctor's murmured instructions drifted from the room, but there was no urgency in the air anymore. After what felt like hours, the doctor stood, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. His eyes were downcast as he looked at the small crowd of officers and hospital staff who had gathered at the door. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of his words. "There's nothing more we can do. He's gone." In the room, Sam lay down beside Jim's still form, his body pressed against his fallen partner. The dog didn't make a sound now, his barking quieted to a low, heartbroken whine. He rested his head on Jim's chest, his eyes filled with confusion and grief. Sam didn't understand the finality of it, not really. He only knew that Jim wasn't getting up. The night had draped a heavy silence over the hospital, save for the soft hum of machinery and the occasional murmur of a nurse passing through the dim corridors. Jim's body lay still, strapped to the gurney, ready to be wheeled out of the room. His face, pale and unmoving, looked like it belonged to someone else, someone who wasn't coming back. Sam, standing rigid by the door. He felt the cold finality in the air, the way people moved around Jim with a quiet resignation. When they started to push the gurney, his instincts kicked in. He lunged forward, teeth clamping down on the metal frame, growling low in his throat. "Sam, easy." Officer Taylor tried to pull him back, but Sam wasn't budging, his jaw locked tight, refusing to let them take Jim. "Get him off there," one of the doctors shouted, but Sam wasn't listening. He bared his teeth, pulling harder, the metal creaking under the force of his grip. "Sam, come on, let go." Taylor tugged harder at the leash, but the dog was relentless, his entire body trembling with the effort to hold the gurney in place. The medical staff paused, exchanging worried glances. Sam wasn't just acting out, he was fighting for something, for someone. His eyes were fixed on Jim's still form, his growls deepening as the seconds ticked by. The room filled with tension, everyone unsure of how to proceed. And then, without warning, Sam released the gurney. He moved quickly, circling around to Jim's side, his muzzle pressing against Jim's chest. He nudged softly, as if trying to stir him awake, a low whine escaping his throat. His eyes, wide and desperate, searched for any sign of life in his partner. One of the nurses started forward, ready to pull Sam back when something impossible happened. Jim's finger twitched. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Sam saw it. His tail stiffened, and he nudged Jim again, more insistent this time. The room had gone completely silent. The doctors stood frozen, watching as Jim's chest rose just slightly, then fell again. And then, like a miracle, a rasping cough broke through the stillness. "He's alive!" someone shouted, the disbelief hanging in the air like a weight that had just been lifted. The medical team sprang into action, rushing to Jim's side, adjusting monitors and checking his pulse. Sam backed away just enough to give them space, but his eyes never left Jim. The dog's body was still tense, as though he feared this fragile moment would slip away. Jim's breaths came shallow and weak, but he was breathing. The doctor, wide-eyed, looked to his colleagues. "We need to stabilize him. Get him back to the ICU now." The hospital staff worked quickly, their earlier certainty shattered, replaced by a sense of urgency. Jim wasn't dead. He was here, fighting. As they wheeled Jim back into the operating room, one of the doctors spoke quietly to Officer Taylor. "Turns out, some of the medication we gave him, it can induce a kind of deep unconscious state, almost like clinical death. It's rare, but—" Taylor looked back at Sam, who was now sitting by the door, exhausted but watchful. "That dog knew something was off before we did." Weeks passed, and Jim's recovery, though slow, was steady. The bullet wounds had left their mark, but the worst of it had been avoided. The doctors couldn't fully explain it, how he'd slipped so close to the edge and then came back. But to Jim, the explanation was simpler. Sam never gave up on him. In the soft morning light, Maplewood Park looked the way it always had, green, peaceful, and calm. Jim, now able to walk without a cane, moved slowly down the familiar path. His steps were careful, but sure. Beside him, Sam padded quietly, every so often glancing up at Jim to check on him, though his usual tension had melted into a quiet confidence. They walked in silence, the air cool and fresh. Jim breathed it in deeply, feeling the weight of the last few months lift, little by little. His body still ached from time to time, and the memories of those dark nights in the hospital lingered, but the worst had passed. Every step he took now, Sam was there, his shadow, his constant companion. Jim paused by a bench, sitting down slowly, Sam settling at his feet. He gazed out over the park, the city moving at its usual pace in the distance. There was no grand moment of realization, no dramatic surge of emotion, just a quiet, steady appreciation for being alive, for having Sam by his side through it all. "We made it, boy," Jim said softly, his hand resting on Sam's head. "Didn't think we would, but we did." Sam's tail thumped against the grass, a gentle acknowledgement. "Wow, what an incredible journey, right?" Jim and Sam's story really shows us the unbreakable bond between a man and his best friend. Loyalty, trust, and never giving up, even when things seem impossible. This isn't just a tale of survival, it's a reminder of the power of resilience and the quiet strength we find in those who stand by us, no matter what. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button. Share it with someone who might need a little reminder to keep pushing forward, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and touch the heart. And, hey, do you have a story about an unbreakable bond with your own loyal companion? Drop it in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. Until next time, take care of those who stand by you, and remember, sometimes the quiet strength of loyalty can make all the difference.